Happy Friday. I'm so glad it's the end of the week. I'm Charlotte. You've probably not seen me for a little while. I joined a Fridays Live about a year ago. And Ellie begged and persuaded me and pushed me to do this week's Friday Live. I'm really, really excited and honoured to be asked to do Fridays Live this week. Not only is it Remembrance weekend and we have released millions of military records this week, but we also have a really special episode, and we're going to be joined a little bit later in about 10 minutes by some guests, really special guests. So they include Will Butler from the National Archives, Elizabeth Smith from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and Jim Smithson from the Great War Group. And they are here to discuss Remembrance, why we have Remembrance, what it means to people, what we see Remembrance being maybe in the future. So hi everyone, I can see lots of people joining from all over the world. I'm in kind of miserable grey Essex. It's stopped raining, but it's still really miserable and grey here. Anyway, so going through Fridays Live and our records for this week. So our question of the week is, what does the act of remembrance mean to you? So have a think about that one. Drop any thoughts and questions as usual in our chat, and we will discuss them as the session goes on. So this week, FindMyPast has been out and about in the wild. You may have seen us pop up in the news. We have recently launched a partnership with the National Trust, and some of my colleagues and I delved into some properties for National Trust and found some amazing stories from those properties and from our records. I'm not going to give anything away because I want you to go and find these articles and have a read through yourself. But they are, there's some great stories, and we had a lot of fun looking through those records. So what's new this week? As I said, this is quite a big military release this week. So we have released over 6.5 million First World War campaign medals to the website, about 5,000 Crimean War casualties records to the site, and about 1,000 Macclesfield First World War hospital records. So a big military release this week. So a little bit of a deeper dive into those records. So my colleague found this story from the Macclesfield First World War hospital records. So this, the records themselves vary in detail, but they are soldiers sent back from the front line who may have been wounded, and you might find information such as their name, the year of birth, their age, the year that they were wounded, or the date that they were wounded, the date that they were sent to the hospital, and potentially their discharge date, and maybe some details about the type of injury that they received and the number of days that they spent there. So this is a story of Sergeant J. Hogan. So he was awarded the Victoria Cross for recapturing a trench from the Germans on the 29th of October 1914. He was told of his award whilst he was at the infirmary recovering from shrapnel wounds. And this is a great example of where we have a record and then use our newspapers to build around that story. So it was reported in the local papers about this soldier, or postman as he was in civilian life. And he sort of said, I can't quite read it now. Where am I? He said that when he was interviewed by the papers, he said, "I've done nothing to deserve that Victoria Cross." But he thinks he probably got it because he was recognised as being one who was involved in that action. So then we have our First World War campaign medals. So I said these are about 6.5 million of these. So these are records for soldiers who at some point in the First World War served and were granted different types of medals. So in this one, I found my great-great-uncle, William John Ward. He was someone I had absolutely no idea about until a few years ago, and my dad and I did a bit of delving through FindMyPast records to try and build our family tree. We had no idea that we had no idea it existed. We had no idea he fought in the First World War. So through my own research, I found that he was born in February 1880, and he died on the 22nd of October 1915 from wounds received in the First World War. Rather tragically, we also found that William had a wife and young daughter, and they also died in 1915 whilst he was away fighting. So that was quite a personal story. It was quite a sort of sad story that we found in my own family tree. And then we have our Crimean War casualties. So again, these will vary in detail. So about 5,000 records of men who were wounded, killed in the Crimean War. So they might include the name, the date they were wounded, the type of casualty. So maybe they were severely wounded. We also found slightly wounded and dangerously wounded. Whatever slightly wounded is, maybe got a slight paper cut or something. I've no idea. So then we have their rank, their unit, and the action that they were involved in. So of course, I found someone who served who was in the Navy, and he was serving in the Naval Brigade during the Crimean War. So this is Captain William Peel. He was awarded the Victoria Cross at the Siege of Sevastopol. He then led a scaling party on the 18th of June, 1855, where he was severely wounded. He survived those wounds, and then he died a few years later. I think it was while he was serving in India, and I think it was sort of like a cholera or smallpox, I can't remember what, but he survived the Crimean War. So newspapers, so we have added 138,000 new pages. We have added one new title, the Ulster Star, and we have updated 4 titles. And they include the Belfast Newsletter, the Mid-Ulster Mail, the Western Evening Herald, and the South Wales Daily Post. So that's what we've released this week. An amazing effort from my colleagues across FindMyPast to get these records sorted and published. They do this every week, and I love them all. Yeah, Ellie's dancing and cheering down below there. So final reminder of the question of the week. What does the act of remembrance mean to you? And that has also just reminded me, and I think Ellie might prod me otherwise, that this weekend we have free access to the site, to our records. So it's the perfect weekend, perfect excuse to dive into our records, maybe be inspired by this Friday Live and find your military ancestors, or just find those relatives you've just always wanted to search for. So yeah, free this weekend. I can see the group chat is, the chat's going. There's so much that's coming through. So hopefully we'll be able to get to that a little bit later on, or as the session goes on. So bear with me, by the way, this is my first time hosting properly Friday's Live, so please bear with me. So I'm hoping all of our guests are ready. They haven't run off. They are excited and waiting to join. So I will just add everyone to the stage. Yeah. There we go. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
Afternoon.
Hi, thank you so much for joining this Friday afternoon. Really, really excited to have you here. And thank you, as I say, so much for taking the time out. I know your very busy lives to be here with us. So first of all, just go around the group, introduce yourselves, the organisation that you're associated with or work for, and tell us more about kind of the work you do that may link to Remembrance, and if you've got any exciting projects coming up. So Elizabeth, as you're kind of next to me, we'll start with you.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Elizabeth. I work for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. I'm their Public Engagement Coordinator for Yorkshire and the North East. And I feel I have to put my cards on the table here and say that I do not have, I don't come from kind of a research background. I'm not a trained historian. I'm coming at this as an amateur. So probably, perhaps like a lot of the people who are watching this, but I do get really excited when I do start to do the research on some of our casualties. So the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, if you're not aware of who we are, we commemorate the 1.8 million casualties who lost their lives during the First and the Second World War. We don't commemorate anybody who died in between the World Wars or since the end of the Second World War, but we do have slightly longer periods of commemoration than you might expect. So we commemorate up until the end of August 1919 for the First World War, and up until the end of December of 1947. So one of the things that about us that might be really useful for people who are researching is that we have details of our casualties, or 1.8 million, or sorry, 1.7 million of them, on our database, which you can access on CWGC.org. So if you have somebody in your family tree who you know died whilst they were serving in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force from across the British Empire, if they died within our dates, then you should be able to find their name on our database, and you'll find out where in the world we commemorate that person. We don't hold records on people such as where they were born and about their story. We just purely hold the details about when they died, who they were serving with, and very basic records like that. However, we have just launched a new project, really exciting project, which is called Forevermore. You might have people who are watching this might have seen some coverage of this in the press. There was a feature on the One Show a couple of weeks ago, and it's a new online resource which we're using to collect the stories of our war dead from across both world wars, and we're asking for members of the public to upload their the stories of people in their family tree or somebody who they've researched, and they can add any photos that they might have, newspaper clippings that they've got, any letters, type up their story, and that will be all collated in one place on our website. So it's a really fantastic way for people to publicize the work that they have done, share the stories of their own families, and hopefully over time that will grow and grow, so that we can have this these stories about our casualties, which add the depth really, and they tell us a bit more about who these people were who gave their life serving. That's
brilliant. I'm really interested and can't wait to see more from that project. Jim, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, Jim Smithson. I'm one of the trustees of the Great War Group. The Great War Group was formed just over 3 years ago now, and the main aim we have, and where it connects with commemoration, is really education, the connection between those two things, in that if you can't really continue the idea of commemoration unless people are informed about what that particular situation is and what the Great War was. Obviously, we're involved with the Great War, not the Second World War, but that's basically one of our themes and one of our goals as a charity. And to that end, we have a quarterly magazine, over 100 pages long, quite a quality one. We're very proud of that. And within that magazine, as well as the normal type of things you might find in a historical magazine, such as thank you, yes, there's the one, and a brilliant example there of something I'll talk about in a moment. But as well as covering the subject like you just saw Verdun, and that might take up about maybe 60% of the magazine. There's lots of other parts of it as well. And some of the very pertinent ones for weekends such as this are the fact that we always have an in memoriam section where people who are members of the group can write in about people they have either researched or they know, and it really gives a sort of a boost to those who are thinking of doing that from a research point of view, what you can find out. And often these things will have guidance as to where they got that information from. So that's always very useful. We also have something about a Commonwealth War Grave cemetery visit. So again, it's educating people about what these places are, and where they are, and what they can, and that always contains something about the people in it. It's not just about, oh, here are a lot of headstones and a really nice location. It's about some of the individuals who are in there. Again, saying that if you visit these cemeteries that Elizabeth and her colleagues look after, you have to think about the people who are in there. It's not just a row of headstones, and also articles by the Commonwealth War Graves in the magazine. So the whole idea of what we do is that to that end. And as well, we have a conference every year, and a focus of that conference is always a part of that is always on the last day on the Sunday is we have a remembrance service. So it doesn't matter what part of the year that is. It's usually around now. It's earlier than the Remembrance weekend, but we have a commemorative service, and we do that whenever we can to just, in a sense, allow members to be involved in that type of thing. And we also have a trip away, which is somewhere into France or Belgium. We've been to Ypres, we've been to Mons. Next year we're in Arras, which is then a battlefield trip and a visit to lots of different things there from that point of view. So how a sort of connection with the whole remembrance thing is, in a sense, the education element, and really educating people about the war and trying to spread that. And certainly if people want to get involved in that and get involved in being actively working in that sort of area, then join us, because many people who are our members, it's the first they've written for the magazine. It's the first time they've ever written for it. They've done research they've never done before. There's lots of experienced people in the group who will guide people through and guide folk how to go about things, whether it's in the National Archives, whether it's in the Commonwealth War Graves, whether it's in FindMyPast, whether it's in all the other possibilities for research. So that's basically where we are as a group.
Yeah, I mean, I think I followed the Great War Group journey from the beginning, and I know how much of a passion project it is. And it is, if anyone out there, definitely go and follow them on social media and delve into them, because they are an amazing group that are doing a lot for the education for the First World War. And last but not least, Will, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm Will Butler, and I'm head of modern collections at the National Archives. But my specific remit is over our military records. So I cover, and I'm one of our specialists on our military records from about certainly the late 18th century up until pretty much the present day. I'm a historian of the British Army specifically, and especially during the 19th and early 20th century. And I'm just in case, for those of you who don't know, the National Archives, we are the official archive of the UK government, and I'm sure that many of you are aware, FindMyPast have digitised millions of our particularly military records, and I'm always very grateful for the ability to search for them through FindMyPast. And I was kind of certainly thinking about this, and I think it's probably the case for all of us, without trying to put words in people's mouths, that in kind of thinking about remembrance, and we kind of do acts of remembrance all the time, all of us, and kind of listening to Elizabeth there and Jim, it's kind of what we do almost every single day is kind of thinking, and I often kind of stop or have the opportunity to stop at this weekend and kind of thinking about Remembrance Day and Remembrance Sunday, that it actually gives us that chance to stop and think about some of those things that we do, maybe reflect on the individuals that we've been thinking a lot about, or been carrying out that research. It's obviously, certainly from my point of view, it's very rarely close family members, though of course I'm constantly remembering those close family members, particularly from the world wars, but quite often we're kind of thinking about people in an abstract way, people we don't know, people we weren't close to, and actually it gives an opportunity to kind of think about some of those stories and reflect on those opportunities. And I always think of it as that real privilege of being able to do that every day. As I say, it is a real privilege being able to gain insight into people's stories, and it's certainly something that, as the National Archives, that we are constantly trying to help people to do, as are FindMyPast, of course. So from that point of view, like I say, it's a really nice chance to stop and reflect, and that's certainly what I'll be doing on Sunday, or yet tomorrow and Sunday indeed as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for introducing yourself. So just had a little look through the chat that's going on, and this comment caught my eye, and I think leads quite nicely into the first question and conversation we're going to have. But they said, I tend not to think of my relatives that died or were injured during both the wars, as it becomes overwhelmingly sad. However, my thoughts tend to be on the images from the Tower of London poppy installation, which is remembering all that gave their lives. This one caught my eye because I was one of the volunteers that planted some of those poppies in the trench all those years ago, and still have mine somewhere in the house. But that is it, isn't it? It's that some people think and remember those with the personal connection, but others remember and think about more broadly anyone and everyone who fought and died during both our wars or beyond. So why is it decades on, do we still stop and remember every 11th November, every Remembrance weekend? And how do you see that evolving in the future? So, Jim, do you want to start with you?
First, I'd like to say interesting that when the lady said all the people in the war, she was actually talking about all the British and Empire troops there, and not the millions of other soldiers who died in the Great War. So one of the things that we try to do with the Great War Group is that idea that it's not all just about remembrance of the British and Empire troops. We try to be more diverse, and I think that's something that's really quite important. And I think that is a development that's happened over the last few years. I think there's been a much bigger move towards, for example, within the Empire, to remembering Indian troops and so on. And I think what that and others from the Empire, and I think that shows how remembrance may move in the future. I think it's got to really have a relevance in a global situation. You have to look at it a little bit more globally. And I think it hopefully, and I'm saying hopefully there, it moves in that direction, because there is a dynamic really in another direction, that it's all about patriotism. It's all about the British. It's all about us. It's all about the Empire. It's all about the fact that we won both of the wars and so on. It's got that sort of connotation to it sometimes. And the present situation for this weekend is a very good example of that, without going into all the politics of that. But it's an example of how it can be manipulated and misused, which is why I've talked about the fact that education is so important for us. But for me, that's why our goal of trying to educate people in the idea that this was a global conflict, that we're actually remembering the armistice was the same for all of the nations. In fact, actually mostly with the Germans, because many of the other nations that were involved, the war in a sense come to an end before the 11th of November. So there's not, that day is very special to the British, but there are other days which are very special to other nations as well. And for me, we sometimes have lost a little bit of that personal element of what remembrance is. And if I do a comparison in France, because I live in France quite a lot, and for them, the 11th of November is particularly that day. And the local people have their local commemorations around their war memorial on that day. It's a public holiday. Everybody can go there. Everywhere's shut. And that makes it a poignant day. I'm wondering whether we're losing some of that. I'd be interested to hear what the other members think about whether are we losing a little bit of that localized poignancy of what that really means in a local setting. I'm handing over there.
Well, I'm quite happy to pick that up, Jim. I mean, I agree with you. We've just got to only look at what's happening around the world now to realise just how fragile peace is, and the enormous sacrifices that have to be made by everybody in order to maintain that. And I actually this morning was with a school that's quite local to me in Pontefract in West Yorkshire, and we went to across from the school. There have their Pontefract Cemetery, and in there we've got some casualties, and we went for a walk around to visit the graves of the World War I casualties. And while we're there, it was really interesting to see. We went to the first grave, and the local guides had left a painted pebble there. and one of the girls in the class was actually one of those guides. And as we went round, we found the pebble that she had painted that one of the guide leaders had taken and put next to the grave. That wasn't the only sign of people visiting the graves, because then when I took the second group across, there was our Eyes on Hands on volunteer was there raking the leaves from the graves of the fallen. And there was also 2 members of the public, quite by chance, they're visiting graves, and they were leaving their own tokens on them. So in that sense, that local those local remembrance acts are taking place in our sites. And I've worked for the Commission since 2018, and each year I've been going actually to that cemetery in the November since then, and each year there are more signs in that particular site that local people are going, and they are remembering. And I think nowadays people can find out so much more about their relatives from the comfort of their own homes that they weren't able to do before, without going to visit a local library and actually physically looking through all the files and records which were there, which I think has really ignited people's interest in remembrance as well.
I think just picking up on sorry.
No, go on, Jim. Go ahead.
There, because I've been going to France and the cemeteries in France for many decades now, and just to back up what she's saying, one of the differences now compared to 30 years ago are the number of people who are visiting relatives, who have found out for the first time about the relatives that they may have lost that they didn't even know about. Maybe even people they knew, grandparents that they knew, but didn't even know they'd fought in the war. And they've since, they're visiting the cemeteries. They're visiting every year. There's a pilgrimage almost. So that almost a revisit of the idea of a pilgrimage has come back. So yeah, I agree with you there, Elizabeth. That people are doing that, and that's what all the things like FindMyPast and like the National Archives. It's what people are really very interested in family history. Sorry, Will, I sort of wanted to jump in on that.
No. It's really important, and it kind of exactly the kind of thing that I was going to say. So, certainly when it comes to the National Archives, we see, obviously family history is a big part of what we do, and that's still enormous for us. It's still an enormous part of our of what we do, and what is family history if it isn't an act of remembrance in kind of carrying out that research and wanting to know more about your family. So certainly from that perspective, it's kind of alive and well from the kind of work that we do. And again, to add to what Elizabeth said, in a previous role, I did an awful lot of work in local communities, working with young people and schools, and that local element to remembrance and both world wars from that perspective was such a crucial part of understanding and the educational side, Jim, in terms of what you're talking there, in terms of viewing both world wars, say in this case through the kind of lens of local history and understanding the impact of conflict on your local area and the people who lived in your local area, and again, as I say, that kind of access to records makes that kind of research much more straightforward in terms of being able to do that. And I think that's where it will go in the future, kind of thinking about where remembrance might go. We've obviously very recently had the First World War centenary. It won't be long until we're thinking about the Second World War centenary. Okay, it's a little while, and I know, Jim, as the Great War Group, you might not want to kind of think about the Second World War in those terms, and I'm sure the First World War will still it's still that kind of cataclysmic event that that isn't going away, and people's interest and want that kind of need to kind of learn and carry out that research in relation to individuals who fought during the First World War will not go away. But as I say, that kind of that centenary of the Second World War is on the horizon, and I can only see the similar kind of models and interest being created as we kind of move into that period as well. At least I certainly hope so. And I don't see why that wouldn't be the case either. And it's just kind of I'm kind of now thinking back to Jim, you're saying about that international element. So of course I kind of mentioned the local element, but absolutely the international element is so crucial. You know, we're doing a lot of work at the moment at the National Archives, thinking particularly around kind of East African soldiers and civilians who served during particularly the Second World War. That's one of our kind of big focuses. You know, personally, I've done an awful lot of work in the kind of, for various reasons, in the kind of near past around both prisoners of war and civilian internees during the Second World War. You know, just thinking also about that kind of civilian sacrifice as well, particularly because of certain sets of records that we've recently been able to make available in our reading rooms that are kind of record cards around prisoners of war and internees, and again being able to kind of stop and reflect and open up new records, you know, almost kind of allows the continuation of that research. You know, sometimes you might feel I've hit a dead end here and I have to stop, and then all of a sudden there's another avenue that you might be able to explore, you know, like some of those sets of records that Charlotte mentioned right at the beginning as well, and using those.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you so much for your thoughts there, and just sort of seeing comments coming through like this one of people who have used not only FindMyPast but also the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, TNA, all sorts of other places, and finding you know, relatives or others, maybe not even necessarily in family, but you know, people that knew their ancestors in our records. As I said, I'm an example of that. I had no idea about my great uncle, and suddenly I've found this whole relative and a whole story that we knew nothing about in our family tree. So that leads again quite nicely into the next sort of topic of conversation. So what are the benefits of researching a wartime ancestor? And if you know nothing about them, and maybe you just saw it flash up that says my ancestor was at the Battle of the Somme or Battle of Jutland or wherever else, how would you go about finding those wartime ancestors? So Will, I'll come to you first as you're at TNA.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'd certainly search FindMyPast as a starting point, absolutely, from a military point of view, because that's often, and indeed the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database as well. If you you know, if you might have an inkling that someone might have been a casualty, because you know the key, certainly from a military perspective, is kind of unlocking those small nuggets of information to be able to then take that research further, whether it be you know, from a naval perspective, a ship that someone might have served upon, or a particular regiment that someone might have served in, if it relates to the British Army, and you know, places like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, or those snippets of records, you know, for both World Wars, this is as well, you know, that you can tap into online, will give you that opportunity. And for me personally, that's kind of the first stage. And then I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm interested in, okay, what is my ancestor? What's the person that I'm researching doing on a daily basis here? So I'm thinking about things like operational records. So that might be unit war diaries in particular, especially for the First World War, again, digitized. But we hold those at the National Archives. And then for the Second World War, those war diaries still exist, unfortunately not digitized, but you can come into our reading rooms to view them. So, you know, they're certainly those first two steps that I would follow. You know, it's obviously crucial to have things like a name and maybe an approximate date of birth. You know, when it comes to civilians, we have obviously things like the 1939 register or census records as well. So, you know, there are those kind of routes into, you know, understanding a little bit more about, you know, where your ancestors were living and what they were potentially doing, again, for both world wars in this context as well. But yeah, that's certainly where I'd start anyway. I don't know whether anyone else.
Well, I would recommend, yes, obviously using the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's database. And as I said, we don't just commemorate up to the armistice. It's up to the end of August 1921 and to the end of December 1947, and not just casualties who were serving in the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force, but we also commemorate in some circumstances people who were serving in what we call auxiliary services, which would be something like the Merchant Navy, the Home Guard, if they fulfill our requirements, which broadly speaking are they killed due to enemy action, then they would be commemorated by us, whereas Army, Navy or Air Force, if they died within those dates, should be commemorated by us, whatever the cause of death was, whether it was illness, whether it was in training or whatever. But we also commemorate over 65,000 civilians from the Second World War that we were asked to do that. So people who were killed by enemy action, for example, so any civilians killed during the Blitz, or civilians who were interned in camps and were and died while they're in those camps as well, they would be commemorated by us, or civilians who lost their lives due to what we would call now friendly fire. So our records are a good place to start if you've got somebody who's died within our dates. And we've also got some how to research guides specifically for First World War casualties, which you can find on our website at CWGC.org. But one of the things I like to do, not being coming from a trained research background, is that I love Google. I love to Google people's names. You'd be surprised what random things you can find. I love to go on FindMyPast, put names in, try. You might not get, say you've got a casualty called Arthur Foley. You might, if you look under Arthur Foley, you might not find anything for Arthur Foley. I'm particularly talking now about your newspaper section, because that's the bit I really, really love. You might not find anything for Arthur Foley, but you might find something for Private A. Foley, same person. You could use the newspaper archive. I just love, because the number of gems I have found out on there about people, I could wallpaper my wall with them. They're just great. I love that, and I'm not as interested as Will is about finding out what people did on a certain day whilst they were serving. I'm kind of interested in any reports that were in local newspapers about them, and that kind of thing. I just love it. I'm just very nosy.
That's all part of being a historian and a researcher, just being very, very nosy and trying to find all of the details.
Oh, and one last place I would say. So when you do your Googles, quite often will find somebody's name on a local site. So for example, the Northeast War Memorial Project, I think it's called, has got hundreds of people from across the Northeast on there. Somebody, I can't remember the name of the person who's done it, has put in an incredible amount of research there. There's a great one of anybody who lost their life in an aircraft crash within Yorkshire, on a Yorkshire aircraft group. There's the Bradford First World War group. You can find some amazing things that people have already researched and put up.
Yeah, I think I'd back up what Will and Elizabeth have just said. You've covered most of the areas you could go into. I think I would add sort of riders of caution with family history, and to actually not be surprised when you begin to go down the rabbit hole of looking at sort of great grandfathers or mothers or whatever, that some of the stories that are supposed fact within the family begin to unravel, and that can be a difficulty. But also it can be difficult to find records sometimes for the Great War, because many of the service records for the Great War were unfortunately burnt in the Second World War, and therefore there's a little bit of a joke amongst people who have done research into Great War soldiers, that if they died, it's actually easier than if they didn't die. And that's because the Commonwealth War Grave, then you get a lot of details about somebody, such as their service number, and etc., which is then when you go to the National Archives, you've already started to narrow down your search. If you're looking for somebody called John Smith and you don't know what their service number is, and you're not even sure what their unit was, then you can be in trouble. But there are lots of ways of doing it. And I think that idea of using as many different ways, and that I've Googled people before when I've almost reached a dead end and come up with names. As long as you cross-reference the name to something which gives you a fact that you're seeing the same person. Because I've known people research somebody and they've gone down completely the wrong path. And you actually see that on the ancestry, sorry about talking about a rival here, but the ancestry site, where people have created family trees, and it may well be the same on FindMyPast, and you realize the family tree is absolutely wrong because they've followed the wrong person. So that can be a difficulty for people, and people have got to be careful. But there's lots of people out there who can help as well, in terms of, and they're not necessarily paid people. They're just people who will help you to research and help you get through the difficulties at times of actually pinning down a relative. One of the things I always go for very early on, looking at the past of someone, are the census records that the National Archives hold. Those early census ones, the ones you know that if they're a 20-year-old in 1916, then you know they're going to be on the 1911 census somewhere, or they should be. And that often gives you a guidance as to where you're going and what things may be, especially if you're already a family member, you know that background. Where do they come from? You know, they lived in Sheffield, they lived in a certain part of Sheffield. So it's narrowing that field down in terms of that research. But yes, I think that what I said at the beginning is that what I found out when I've done research for people in the past is that sometimes you have to disappoint the family. And so families have to understand that they may realize that something they thought was that their grandfather or their great-grandfather went over the top on the first day of the Somme, they may find is not actually true and they never left the UK. That can happen. So be wary that you may find things that alter your perspective of your past or your family's past.
Definitely, yeah.
And I guess that.
Sorry, go on, Will.
So I was just going to say, kind of, I think that's a really important point, and you know, the kind of those pitfalls of research are really important to bear in mind, and kind of the expectation. But you know, just because, you know, I often say, you know, just because an ancestor didn't go over the top on the 1st of July 1916 doesn't mean their individual story is any less interesting either. Of course, you know, that is, you know, the whole point. And again, you know, those what are initially potentially disappointments in kind of the research and side of things actually turn into kind of opportunities to actually understand for your family history even better than you did previously. I guess it's kind of certainly one thing that I would stress too.
And it can be very amusing as well at times when you find out that the gentle grandfather that you knew as this very gentle man, and you find out from his military records that he's actually a very naughty boy. But that was actually a nice, amusing thing for the family. Did he do that? Oh, wow. There's nothing nasty. He was just a naughty boy, so to speak, but a very good soldier.
Yeah, I had that with, I mean, I never knew my dad's dad, but my dad said when he found out his dad was in the Navy and was a boxer in the Navy, and like did a bit of sort of gambling on the side with the boxing and beat one of his sort of comrades up quite badly, quite frequently. My dad was like, "Oh, he was never came across like that." So that was always an interesting one for us to find out. So yeah, we have more coming in from our question of the week. So Gillian says, remembering those who died in wartime has given me a better perspective. I found a few on my dad's side via the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, but unfortunately my mum's grandfather served as a stoker in the Royal Navy during, I'm guessing that's the First World War, and died on active service. He went down with the ship, so no headstone.
So if I could just jump in then, so that sounds like a casualty that we would commemorate, and a lot of our casualties, in fact, for the First World War, I think we commemorate over 1.1 million casualties, and around half of those are buried in the ground, and around half are who we refer to as the missing. So they are bodies that were lost, maybe lost at sea, but everybody is commemorated somewhere. So if Gillian would like to search on our database, put in the name of her mum's grandfather, she should find out where he is commemorated, and I would guess that would be on one of our naval memorials. So Portsmouth, Plymouth, Chatham, big naval memorials. It's likely that his name will be somewhere, or should be somewhere. So looking on our database, Gillian would be able to find out exactly where he's commemorated.
Definitely, I think that's something that, again, you know, if you go to, I've been to Belgium and France and places many times, and you see rows of headstones, but then you also see, you know, we know that there were so many missing and the bodies have not been found, whether they were in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, but that there are memorials not only in the UK but around the world, you know, dedicated to those missing, those who were never found, and you know that we found ways of commemorating and remembering all in some, hopefully in some form,
Yeah, it was one of the principles of the commission that everybody would be remembered by name. So everybody's name should be somewhere, whether on a headstone or on a memorial.
I know, Elizabeth, you've prepared a kind of case study or story that you found. So if you would like to share that with us now.
Yeah, that's right. So just this week, actually, I was looking for someone because I know we wanted to think about particularly of civilians who had undertaken some kind of voluntary service and lost their lives during the war. So as I've already explained, for the Second World War, the Commission has this civilian roll of honour. You can search our civilians on our online database. We actually have a physical roll of honour with their names in, which is kept at Westminster Abbey. And those civilians, over 65,000 of them, there might have been somebody who was what perhaps I would call a complete civilian. They were just somebody who was unfortunately caught in the Blitz. So a mother and a baby or whoever sheltering in the air raid shelter and got caught, or so on. But also on our civilian list are people who were in voluntary roles as well, like, for example, Doris Eubank. So she was actually a volunteer with the Women's Voluntary Service. So I was just doing some reading about the Women's Voluntary Service, or the WVS. It was a voluntary organisation. It was there for women to help with the war effort. So they were doing things like helping with evacuated children, distributing clothing to those who had lost everything, during the Blitz, setting up mobile canteens, looking after the injured, a whole wide range of tasks. And I looked on the WVS's website. They are now called the RVS, the Royal Voluntary Service. And I found that they had a roll of honour as well. And they keep their roll of honour at Westminster Abbey. And it looks, from the images that I've seen of it, that as it's a huge big book that I think has actually been handwritten, all nicely illustrated. They've got over 245 members of the WVS who lost their lives during World War II. And the information you can see at the bottom, so this is pertaining to Doris Eubank. The bit at the bottom where it says Whitley Bay, 10th of April 1941, Doris Eubank, ambulance driver, and then killed on duty while driving her ambulance. All of that bit came from their roll of honour. They've scanned it in, and you can find it on their website. So Doris is recorded in our civilian roll of honour as well. So I went on the FindMyPast to the newspaper archive, and I actually found news stories there about this roll of honour, and there were appeals post-war in newspapers from the WVS asking people to send in information about their volunteers who'd lost their lives. And then this huge big book, it would appear from your newspaper archive, was then taken around the country once it was made, so that people could see it. And there were stories in from Edinburgh and from Chester showing this book being taken to different places. And then I also found, interestingly, when I looked in the newspaper article under Doris's name, there was this little newspaper account about how her parents, mother, had paid for a fountain in her name up in the northeast where she is, and her story is also on the Northeast War Project as well on their website. So it was just incredible. She was actually a primary school teacher. That drawing of her, painting of her, had hung in her school at Backworth Primary after her death. Those photos there are showing our civilian roll of honour at Westminster Abbey. I think it's in St George's Chapel in Westminster Abbey. And on the right hand side, that little bit from your from FindMyPast showing the book. I think it was when it was taken to Coventry, not Chester, when it's taken to Coventry to be shown there. So I just cannot wait. I only found this story on Monday. I cannot wait to go through this role and find out some more information about these casualties, and then I'm hoping to put that information onto our new story section forevermore on the CWGC website to share that information even wider.
Wow, that's an amazing story. I was just listening to you, and I've completely forgotten I'm supposed to be doing things at the moment. Thank you for sharing that. That was a really good story. Thank you so much. So I think we've had some questions come in, so I'm just going to dive back into the comments. So, Will, does the diverse nature of the British population reflect the areas of the First World War being researched? And this can open up to the rest of you as well.
Yeah, I think my short answer is yes, absolutely. And again, over probably the last 5 years or so, we've done an awful lot of work in local communities across the UK and the work that's being carried out and the research that's being done does reflect that kind of the diverse nature of the population, and groups like the Great War Group, and exactly what Jim was saying, right at the start in terms of their remit and what they do is doing exactly that, as you said, Jim, and this is where I kind of get you to try and jump in as well in terms of that diverse nature of research, because I know a lot of the stuff that you do is exactly that, and as you said earlier, kind of looking at the conflict from different perspectives as well, and because ultimately what it does is enrich our understanding of the conflict. That's ultimately what it's there to do, isn't it? Is not looking at the First World War, or indeed any war, from one perspective and from one dimension. We're actually it's allowing us and giving us that opportunity again to look at conflict from different perspectives as well.
I mean, our last conference was in Brighton, and we just took the opportunity there of linking the Brighton past with the Indian Army, because it has this link with the Indian Army, with the use of a hospital there in the early part of the wars, and also the Shatri, which is the area north of Brighton in the countryside, where a number of Sikh or Muslim soldiers of the time were cremated, and there's now a memorial there, a Shatri. And so our conference actually had the Friday evening devoted to the Indian Army, with a talk about the Indian Army, its role, and then a discussion with people who were actually involved with the history of the Indian Army and so on. And then on the Sunday, the members of the group who were still there, we all went to the Shatri north of Brighton to actually visit that and be talked through it by Tom Donovan, who is one of the people looking after that memorial. And that's the sort of thing we're trying to do, because that was a linkage. It links parts of Britain with parts of the empire. And then on the other side of that, we also try and remember those of other nations. And when we go to, for example, when we go to France on a visit, we will visit French or German cemeteries and basically make it very clear that this is not just a British and Commonwealth these days, but British and Empire warfare, but a global warfare. But yes, certainly the British population, we try and reflect that. And we would love to have more people involved from those different minorities or different elements of the British populace. It can be difficult because they've often found organisations such as Great War organisations difficult to get involved with. They find a little bit they don't find it easy, and we're welcoming, but even our welcoming idea has not got as much involvement as we would like. So if there are people out there who are of any sort of different areas of the social spectrum in Britain who would like to get involved in Great War research and so on, we are very welcoming to all and sundry.
I know the Bradford World War I group, with whom I've done some work with. They are very open, and they've done a lot of research for different sectors of the Bradford population now, and they're really keen on making sure that when they're talking, they're covering a diverse range of stories from people of different cultures, and they've got some fascinating things on their website.
Excellent.
Great. So coming towards the end of the session, if anyone listening has any other questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll hopefully get to them. But now to bring it to the three of you, maybe a bit more personally. So I know, Elizabeth, you shared the story of Doris, but Elizabeth, for you as well, Jim, Will, is there anyone you're remembering this weekend or any other point? Or are there any stories that you've come across in your research, either recently or just one, you know, from years ago that has always stuck in your mind?
Personally, very strange. I come from, basically hail from Sheffield, and all my ancestors around the times of the First World War worked in the steel industry. And one grandfather, actually, my paternal grandfather, actually joined up when as soon as he could in 1914 to stand in that rush for the new army of call from Kitchener. And he was actually in the training camp when they came for fetch him and get him out and actually take him back to the steelworks, because he had a very specific job at the steelworks and he wasn't allowed to join up. And I never knew him, but my father used to say that he talked of the great difficulties of actually being in Sheffield during those times, and the fact that until they gave men some proof as to why they were walking the streets still, he actually went through months of being harangued in the street. A little less, I think, in Sheffield than other parts of the country, because in Sheffield they realised that there was the big steelworks in Sheffield, Rotherham and so on. A lot of men were still there, but he still was harangued at times. And that was always a story I sort of think about when I think of we always think of the men who went to fight, but there was also the large elements of men who would, and he was working, he had to move from his usual, it sounds awful these days, doesn't it? His usual 60-hour shift for the week, shift work, and he moved to an 80-hour shift work. So he was shifted up 20 hours because of the need to work. And he also talked about, to my father, it's all through my father, he also talked about the fact that in Good Sheffield, we always they always talked about them who fell on, this is Good Sheffield now, they always talked about them who fell on front, but what about those who fell in works? What he means is there were many, many casualties, civilian casualties in the workplace because of the way they were having to work. All health and safety things were just thrown aside. We have to produce all of this stuff. If we have a few casualties, so be it. And those sort of casualties of war that are not always thought about. People like the WS who worked in the war and so on, especially in the Second World War, wartime. With the Great War, a lot of civilian casualties, and they're not necessarily from enemy actions such as Zeppelin raids. They're also from, for example, the shell filling factories and deaths and so on from either explosions there or just simply illness from working in those factories, or steelworks where men were killed on a regular basis, or the mines where people were killed because of the need to rapidly extract coal. And I think it's an area that's not very well researched. And I think that's something that, for me personally, is something that I'd probably like to do sometime. So that's my personal side of things on Remembrance.
Yeah, and just on that, my great grandfather was a miner in South Wales during the Second World War, and he was a miner prior to the Second World War. But exactly that kind of preserved occupation, and again, certainly thinking about civilians in wartime and that kind of very different kind of sacrifice, but nonetheless kind of crucial. The other person, and it's interesting that we had the question earlier about the kind of casualty at sea, specifically that I certainly remember is my great uncle Norman, who was killed at the end of October 1942. He was a merchant seaman, and he was lost at sea. He's commemorated on the Tower Hill Memorial, and again, I only know that because of the CWGC database, which CWGC which commemorates him. But he's certainly someone who I specifically pause and think about. He was 18 at the time of his death. He'd again, it's that story, that family story. Ran away at 16 and became an apprentice and a merchant seaman and didn't come home. So he's certainly someone who I think about. I know that his death had an enormous impact on my grandfather and the family more generally, and that kind of never went away either. So and kind of being able to continue that act of remembrance now that kind of that grandparents aren't here, certainly his brother is no longer around either. It's really important for me, and again gives me pause at this time of year for sure.
And I've one of the fortunate few who my grandparents were the wrong age to be involved in either the First or the Second World War. But I'm very moved by the stories of particularly our younger casualties and those who are a long way from home. So I spend a lot of time in our big Air Force cemetery near at Stonefall, which is near Harrogate, on the outskirts of Harrogate. And there we've got some very young casualties, 2 17-year-olds who are Canadians. The big plot there has got over 900 graves in it. Most of them are Royal Canadian Air Force, but there's also Australians, a fighter pilot from Fiji, some men from the Caribbean, and it's going there and thinking about those chaps whose stories I've researched, and they're so far from home and so young, because the majority of them were just in their early 20s and teenagers, and that's where I will be on Sunday. Great.
Well, that brings us to the end of this discussion. I've really enjoyed it. I've just been grateful to just sit here and listen to the three of you talk. You've got some amazing stories and experiences. So just as a reminder that FindMyPast has free access all weekend. So maybe some of these discussions have inspired you to delve into your military ancestors or the civilians or whoever during both world wars. But once again, thank you to Elizabeth, Jim and Will for joining us on this Friday afternoon. I hope you all have a great weekend, and to our listeners out there, I hope you all have a great weekend too. Thank you so much.